The letter arrived on the first day of spring in 1874, carried by a dusty stagecoach that rolled into Chisum Ranch, Texas, with a screech of wooden wheels and the snort of exhausted horses. Thomas Jenkins tucked the envelope into his coat pocket without opening it, his calloused fingers lingering on the delicate handwriting that spelled out his name. He had waited 6 months for this response, and now that it had arrived, he found himself oddly hesitant to read the words that would change his life forever. The small frontier town of Chisum Ranch sat nestled between rolling hills and sprawling plains, a collection of weathered buildings clinging to existence in the harsh Texas landscape. At 32, Thomas had carved out a respectable life for himself, a cattle ranch just outside of town, a modest but sturdy 2-story house built with his own hands, and enough savings to provide for a family. What he didn't have was a wife, a fact that gnawed at him during the long, quiet evenings when the only sounds were the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the tall grass. That night, seated at his oak table with a lamp burning low, Thomas finally opened the letter. Inside was a photograph of a young woman with intelligent eyes and a tentative smile, along with a letter written in a careful hand. Penelope Lawson of Boston, Massachusetts, had accepted his proposal. She would arrive by month's end. "Well, I'll be," Thomas murmured to himself, studying her face in the lamplight. Her eyes held a quiet determination that resonated with him. She wrote of her life in Boston, of working as a schoolteacher until her parents' deaths left her alone, of her hopes for a new beginning in Texas. She was 24, educated, and by her own admission, not afraid of hard work or challenges. Thomas wrote back immediately, confirming their arrangement and providing details for her journey. He worked tirelessly in the weeks that followed, expanding the house, adding feminine touches he thought might please a Boston lady, curtains at the windows, a proper dining table, even a small garden plot that he'd cultivated with flowers instead of the usual vegetables. His neighboring ranchers teased him mercilessly about his preparations, but there was no malice in their words, just the good-natured ribbing of men who had traveled the same path before him. The day Penelope was scheduled to arrive dawned clear and warm. Thomas had arranged for the stagecoach to bring her directly to his ranch rather than stopping in town first, sparing her the curious stares of townsfolk. He'd polished his boots, trimmed his beard, and donned his least worn shirt. His ranch hand, Miguel, had laughed outright at the sight of his boss fidgeting like a schoolboy. "Patron, you will scare her away looking so stiff," Miguel had joked before riding out to check the north pasture. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Thomas began to worry. The stagecoach was hours overdue. He paced the length of his front porch, watching the distant road with growing concern. When he finally heard the rumble of wheels, the sun was already sinking toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds. The stagecoach appeared, moving slowly, too slowly. Something was wrong. Thomas strode down the path as it pulled to a stop, dust billowing around the tired horses. The driver, a weathered man named Elijah whom Thomas knew well, jumped down with unusual haste. "Tom. Get over here quick," he called, his voice tight with urgency. "Your lady's in a bad way." Thomas rushed to the coach door as Elijah pulled it open. Inside, a young woman was slumped against the seat, her face pallid and glistening with sweat. Her travel dress, once fine but now crumpled and stained, clung to her frame. "Miss Lawson." Thomas reached inside, his heart pounding. "Miss Lawson, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, revealing the same intelligent gaze he'd seen in her photograph, now clouded with fever. She attempted to speak, but her words were incoherent. As Thomas carefully lifted her from the coach, her body burned against his arms. "The journey was too much," Elijah explained, retrieving a small trunk and carpet bag. "Started looking poorly at the last stop. Refused to delay any further, insisted on reaching you today." Thomas carried her toward the house, her weight slight in his arms. As they reached the front door, she stirred, her eyes focusing briefly on his face. "Mr. Jenkins," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Yes, Miss Lawson," he answered softly, pushing the door open with his shoulder. I'm Thomas Jenkins. She made an effort to straighten, to present herself properly despite her condition, but the movement proved too much. Her eyes rolled back, and she went limp in his arms, collapsing completely against him just as they crossed the threshold. Thomas felt a surge of protectiveness as he gazed down at the unconscious woman who had traveled thousands of miles to be his wife. He whispered words that came from somewhere deep within him, a promise he hadn't known he was ready to make until that very moment. "Rest easy, Miss Lawson. I've been waiting for you." The next days passed in a blur of worry and watchfulness. Thomas sent for the town's doctor, Samuel Wilson, who diagnosed Penelope with a severe case of travel fever exacerbated by exhaustion. The doctor left medicine and instructions, his expression grave but not hopeless. "She's young and appears healthy otherwise," Dr. Wilson said. "Keep her cool, get fluids in her when she's conscious, and pray." Thomas had never considered himself much of a praying man, but in the quiet hours of the night, as he sat beside Penelope's bed watching the rise and fall of her chest, he found himself bargaining with God in whispered pleas. He'd written to her out of practicality, seeking a partner for the lonely life of a rancher. But as he bathed her fevered brow and spoke soft encouragements to her unconscious form, he realized something unexpected was taking root in his heart. On the fourth day, as Thomas was spooning broth between Penelope's parched lips, her eyes opened fully for the first time since her arrival. They were a striking shade of hazel, flecked with gold that caught the afternoon light streaming through the window. "Mr. Jenkins." Her voice was weak but clear. Thomas nearly dropped the spoon in his surprise. "You're awake. How are you feeling, Miss Lawson?" She attempted to sit up, wincing with the effort. Thomas quickly moved to assist her, arranging pillows behind her back. "I'm terribly sorry," she said, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment rather than fever. "This isn't how I planned to present myself to my future husband." Thomas felt a smile tug at his lips. "I reckon neither of us planned on you arriving half dead, Miss Lawson. But you're on the mend now, and that's what matters." She took in her surroundings, the simple but comfortable bedroom Thomas had prepared for her, the vase of wildflowers on the bedside table, her unpacked trunk in the corner. "You've been caring for me all this time?" she asked, her eyes returning to his face with new interest. "Yes, madam. Doctor's been by every other day, and Mrs. Thornton from town came to help with, certain necessities." Thomas cleared his throat, suddenly aware of the intimacy of their situation. "But mostly it's been me." Penelope was silent for a moment, studying him with those intelligent eyes that had first caught his attention in her photograph. "Thank you," she finally said. "I don't know many men who would tend to a sick stranger instead of simply sending her back where she came from." "You're not a stranger, Miss Lawson," Thomas replied, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "And this is your home now if you still want it to be." The days that followed marked a slow but steady recovery for Penelope. Thomas moved his belongings to the small bunkhouse near the barn, giving her full use of the main house. Each morning, he would bring fresh eggs and milk for her breakfast, then attend to his ranch duties while she rested. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch if she felt strong enough, or in the parlor if the night air was too cool, and talk. Thomas learned that Penelope was the daughter of a banker and his wife, raised with every advantage until her parents' deaths left her nearly penniless. She had supported herself by teaching while living in a boarding house, until the prospect of spending her life as a spinster schoolteacher drove her to answer his advertisement. "I didn't want charity or pity," she explained one evening, her hands busy with mending work. "I wanted a purpose, a place of my own, and perhaps companionship." In turn, Thomas shared his own story, his journey west from Tennessee after the war, the years of backbreaking work to establish his ranch, the loneliness that had finally prompted him to seek a mail-order bride. "My mother would have been scandalized," Penelope admitted with a small smile. "But I think she also would have understood. Life rarely follows the path we expect." As Penelope regained her strength, she began to take on small tasks around the house, despite Thomas's protests that she should continue to rest. He would return from the pastures to find bread baking in the oven, or shirts he'd thrown in the mending pile now neatly repaired and folded on his bunk. One afternoon, he discovered her in the garden, her hands covered in soil as she planted vegetable seeds alongside the flowers he'd started. "The flowers are lovely," she said when she noticed him watching, "but a garden should be practical as well as beautiful, don't you think?" Thomas could only nod, struck by how right she looked kneeling in the Texas dirt, her Boston sensibilities already adapting to frontier practicality. 2 weeks after her arrival, Dr. Wilson declared Penelope fully recovered, though he advised continued caution against overexertion. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching a spectacular sunset paint the sky, Thomas cleared his throat nervously. "Miss Lawson, Penelope, now that you're well, I reckon we should discuss our arrangement." She turned to him, her face difficult to read in the fading light. "Yes, I suppose we should. The town has a small church. The preacher comes through twice a month. He'll be here this Sunday." Thomas twisted his hat in his hands. "But if you've changed your mind, if this isn't what you expected, I'd understand. I could arrange passage back to Boston or anywhere else you might want to go." Penelope was quiet for so long that Thomas felt his heart sink. Of course she would want to leave. What had he been thinking? A refined Boston lady would never be content with the harsh realities of ranch life with a rough man like him. "Mr. Jenkins, Thomas," she finally said, her voice soft but steady, "when I accepted your proposal, I made a commitment. I didn't do so lightly then, and I certainly wouldn't back away now after all you've done for me." "I don't want you to stay out of gratitude or obligation," Thomas said quickly. "That's not why I'm staying." She turned to face him fully. "I'm staying because in these 2 weeks I've seen the kind of man you are. You're honorable, hardworking, and kind. Those are rare qualities anywhere, but especially valuable in a husband." Thomas felt a weight lift from his shoulders. "So you'll marry me on Sunday?" "Yes," she answered with a smile that reached her eyes. "I believe I will." The wedding was a simple affair held in Chisum Ranch's whitewashed church. The entire town turned out for the event, curious to see Thomas Jenkins's mail-order bride, who had arrived more dead than alive, and now stood beside him at the altar. Her cheeks flushed with health rather than fever. Penelope wore a dress of pale blue that she had sewn herself during her convalescence, with flowers from their garden woven into her upswept hair. Thomas, in his best suit, looked both terrified and elated as he repeated his vows in a voice that carried clearly through the small church. "Never seen Jenkins look so cleaned up," whispered one rancher to his wife. "Never seen him smile so much either," she replied with satisfaction. After the ceremony, the townspeople hosted a celebration at the hotel's dining room. There was food, music from a local fiddler, and dancing that continued well into the evening. Thomas, who had never been one for social gatherings, surprised everyone including himself by leading Penelope through several dances, his usual reserve melting away under her encouraging smile. As the night drew to a close, Elijah, the stagecoach driver who had brought Penelope to Chisum Ranch, approached the couple with a glass raised high. "To Thomas and Penelope Jenkins," he called out, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Proof that sometimes the best journeys have rough starts but fine endings." The room echoed with cheers and well wishes as Thomas and Penelope made their way outside to the waiting wagon that would take them home. The stars overhead were brilliant in the clear Texas sky, a canopy of diamonds across the velvet darkness. "Are you happy, Mrs. Jenkins?" Thomas asked as he helped her into the wagon. Penelope looked up at the man who had nursed her through fever, who had given her time to know him before claiming his rights as a husband, who now gazed at her with such tender uncertainty. "Yes, Mr. Jenkins," she answered, squeezing his hand. "I believe I am." That night, as husband and wife, they discovered another kind of language between them. Thomas was gentle, patient, mindful of Penelope's inexperience, and she was brave and trusting, meeting him halfway in this new territory. When they lay together afterward, her head resting on his chest, Thomas felt a completeness he had never known before. "I never expected this," Penelope confessed in the darkness. "What's that?" he asked, stroking her hair, "to feel so at home with someone I've known for such a short time." "When I agreed to be a mail-order bride, I hoped for respect, perhaps friendship eventually. I didn't dare hope for more." Thomas pulled her closer. "And now," she lifted her head to look at him, her eyes reflecting the moonlight streaming through the window. "Now I think perhaps we've been given a rare gift, a chance to build something true, something lasting." In the months that followed, Penelope and Thomas settled into the rhythm of married life on the ranch. The transition wasn't without challenges. Penelope's first attempt at making biscuits resulted in what Thomas kindly referred to as ammunition. Her soft hands blistered from washing clothes and tending the garden. The isolation of ranch life sometimes left her yearning for the bustle of Boston streets. But for every difficulty, there were moments of discovery and joy. Penelope proved to be a quick learner, adapting her city knowledge to frontier necessities. She took over the household accounts, revealing a head for numbers that impressed Thomas. When one of the ranch hands cut himself badly on barbed wire, it was Penelope who calmly cleaned and stitched the wound, her teacher's steadiness proving valuable in a crisis. Thomas found himself changed as well. He began to see his land through Penelope's fresh eyes, appreciating beauty he had long taken for granted. He started building shelves for the books she had brought from Boston, creating a small library in a corner of their parlor. In the evenings, they would often read aloud to each other, Thomas stumbling sometimes over unfamiliar words, Penelope never correcting but quietly helping when needed. One autumn afternoon, as Penelope was hanging laundry in the yard, she noticed a cloud of dust approaching from the main road. Shading her eyes, she made out a wagon moving at high speed toward the ranch house. Thomas and the hands were out checking the herd, and she felt a moment of apprehension being alone. As the wagon drew nearer, she recognized Elijah driving, but something was wrong. He was hunched forward, and there appeared to be someone lying in the wagon bed behind him. "Mrs. Jenkins," he called out as he pulled the horses to a stop. "Need help bad." Penelope ran to the wagon to find a young woman writhing in pain, her swollen belly making her condition obvious. "She's having a baby," Elijah explained breathlessly. "Found her and her husband on the trail. Their wagon broke an axle. He's staying with their other kids while I brought her to town, but she started having pains, something fierce. Town's too far now." Penelope acted without hesitation. "Bring her inside." Quickly, together, they carried the woman into the house and laid her on Penelope and Thomas's bed. The woman, who introduced herself as Sarah between contractions, was clearly in advanced labor. "I've never delivered a baby," Penelope admitted as she gathered clean linens and heated water. "I've had 3 of my own," Sarah gasped. "Just catch it when it comes." For the next 2 hours, Penelope worked to keep Sarah comfortable as the labor progressed. She sent Elijah to fetch Thomas and then to continue to town for the doctor. When Thomas arrived, he took one look at the situation and turned pale. "I'll be outside if you need me," he said, backing toward the door. "Thomas Jenkins, you will stay right here," Penelope commanded. "I need you to hold her hands and help her sit up when I tell you." To his credit, Thomas did as he was told, though his face remained ashen throughout the ordeal. When Sarah's baby boy finally arrived, squalling his displeasure at the world, Penelope found herself laughing through tears of relief and wonder. "You did it, Mrs. Jenkins," Thomas said with awe as she wrapped the newborn in a clean cloth and placed him in his mother's arms. "We all did," Penelope corrected, but she felt a surge of pride at what she had accomplished. Dr. Wilson arrived an hour later to find mother and baby doing well under Penelope's attentive care. After checking them both, he pulled Penelope and Thomas aside. "Mrs. Jenkins, you have a steady hand and a cool head. The town could use someone with your skills. Would you consider helping me occasionally? There are women who would prefer a female attendant for certain conditions." Penelope glanced at Thomas, who nodded his encouragement. "I would be honored, doctor," she replied. That night, after Sarah and her baby had been moved to the guest room to rest, Penelope and Thomas sat before the fire in the parlor, both exhausted but too stimulated by the day's events to sleep. You were amazing today, Thomas said, reaching over to take her hand. I've never seen anything like it. I was terrified, Penelope admitted, but there wasn't time to think about fear. Thomas was quiet for a moment, then asked hesitantly, Do you think you might want children of our own someday? Penelope turned to him, her heart full. Yes, I think I would like that very much. The seasons turned, and winter settled over Chisum Ranch with surprising ferocity. The cattle required constant attention as cold fronts swept down from the north, bringing freezing temperatures and occasional snow that was unusual for that part of Texas. Thomas and his men worked long hours in the bitter cold, checking on the herd, breaking ice on water troughs, and distributing supplemental feed. Penelope kept the home fires burning literally and figuratively. She had the ranch house prepared for winter with quilts she had sewn during the autumn months, shelves stocked with preserves from their garden's harvest, and always a hot meal ready when Thomas came in from the cold. She also began to assist Dr. Wilson more regularly, riding with him to attend to patients when weather permitted. The Christmas holiday brought a brief respite from winter's harshness. Thomas and Penelope hosted a dinner for their closest neighbors and the ranch hands, the house filled with warmth, laughter, and the scent of pine boughs Penelope had used to decorate. They exchanged simple gifts. Penelope had knitted Thomas a scarf from soft wool, while he surprised her with a writing desk he had secretly constructed in the barn during stolen moments. For your letters, he explained as she ran her fingers over the smooth surface. And maybe someday for your stories. Penelope looked at him in surprise. She had mentioned once, in passing, a childhood dream of writing stories like those in the books she loved. That he had remembered and encouraged this forgotten aspiration touched her deeply. Thank you, she whispered, reaching up to kiss him. It's perfect. January brought the harshest blizzard in living memory. For 3 days, the world outside was nothing but howling wind and swirling white. Thomas and 2 hands who had been checking the far pasture when the storm hit were forced to shelter in the lined shack overnight, leaving Penelope alone in the main house. She kept herself busy, keeping fires lit in both the kitchen and parlor stoves, melting snow for water when the pump froze, and recording her thoughts at her new desk. When the winds finally died down on the 3rd day, she bundled herself in every warm garment she owned and made her way to the barn to check on the animals there. The sight that greeted her was one of heartbreak. A section of the barn roof had partially collapsed under the weight of snow, and 2 of their best milk cows lay dead beneath the debris. Penelope worked for hours, clearing what snow she could and ensuring the surviving animals had food and unfrozen water. When Thomas finally returned, leading his exhausted horse through drifts up to its chest, Penelope met him at the door, her face streaked with tears of relief. I thought I'd lost you, she said, pulling him inside and helping him remove his ice-crusted coat. Takes more than a blizzard to keep me from coming home to you, he replied, his voice rough with exhaustion. When she told him about the barn and the lost cows, he merely nodded grimly. We're luckier than most. The Thorntons lost their entire north herd. The winter of 1874-1875 would long be remembered in Chisum Ranch for its brutality. By the time spring's first tentative green appeared in March, the Jenkins ranch had lost nearly a quarter of its cattle. Many neighboring ranches had fared worse, and some families decided to leave Texas altogether, heading further west in search of better prospects. Should we consider leaving too? Penelope asked one evening as they tallied their remaining resources. Thomas looked up, surprised. Do you want to leave? She considered the question seriously. No, she finally said. This is our home now. We've weathered one bad season. We can rebuild. The determination in her voice stirred something in Thomas. This woman who had arrived on his doorstep barely alive less than a year ago now stood beside him with the resolve of a true pioneer. He reached across the table and took her hand. Together we can face anything, he agreed. Spring brought new life to the ranch. The garden flourished under Penelope's care, the surviving cattle began to calve, and the sound of hammers echoed as Thomas and his men repaired winter's damage. Penelope continued her work with Dr. Wilson, her reputation for competence and compassion spreading throughout the county. It was after returning from assisting with a difficult birth in town that Penelope first suspected her own condition. She had been feeling unusually tired, certain foods suddenly turned her stomach, and her monthly cycle had not appeared for 2 months running. She kept her suspicions to herself for another week, wanting to be certain before sharing the news with Thomas. On a perfect April evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Penelope finally spoke the words she had been holding close to her heart. "Thomas, I believe I'm going to have a baby." He turned to her, his expression moving from shock to wonder to joy in quick succession. "A baby, are you sure?" Penelope nodded, unable to contain her smile. "Dr. Wilson confirmed it today. We're going to be parents come November." Thomas whooped with delight, lifting Penelope from her chair and spinning her around before setting her down with sudden concern. "Should I not do that? Will it hurt the baby?" Penelope laughed. "The baby is fine. I'm not made of glass, Thomas." He placed a gentle hand on her still flat stomach, his eyes filled with wonder. "A baby," he repeated softly. "Our baby." The summer of 1875 was as gentle as the previous winter had been harsh. The ranch flourished, the cattle regained their strength, and Penelope blossomed with her pregnancy. Her work with Dr. Wilson naturally transitioned to focus more on expectant mothers and newborns as her own knowledge and experience grew. In July, they received a letter that brought unexpected news. The railroad was expanding, and a new line would pass within 5 miles of Chisum Ranch. The town council, recognizing the potential for growth, had voted to establish a proper school and was seeking a qualified teacher. Given Penelope's background in education, several council members had suggested approaching her for the position. "They want me to teach." Penelope asked, rereading the letter in disbelief. "Is that something you'd want to do?" Thomas asked carefully. With the baby coming and all, Penelope considered the question. "Not immediately, perhaps, but eventually, yes, I think I would. I miss teaching sometimes. And our child will need education, as will the children of all these new families likely to arrive once the railroad comes." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "We could build a small house in town, use it when you're teaching, rent it out when you're not. Might be a good investment with the railroad coming." The way he casually included her professional aspirations in their future plans, treating them as valuable and worthy of support, reinforced for Penelope how fortunate she had been in her choice of husband. She reached for his hand, bringing it to rest on her growing belly where their child had just kicked. "Feel that. I think someone approves of the plan." As summer gave way to fall, Penelope's pregnancy advanced without complications. Thomas became increasingly protective, limiting her activities despite her protests that she remained perfectly capable of normal tasks. Their good-natured arguments about what she should and shouldn't do became a source of amusement for the ranch hands. Boss nearly had a fit when he caught Mrs. Jenkins on a ladder picking apples yesterday, Miguel reported to the others over supper in the bunkhouse. Carried her down like she was made of china, then picked every last apple himself while she stood there telling him which ones to get. October brought the completion of their townhouse, a modest but comfortable dwelling within walking distance of the planned school building. Thomas had overseen its construction personally, insisting on quality materials and practical features like built-in bookshelves and a deep porch where Penelope could sit with the baby during warm weather. "It's perfect," Penelope declared when he gave her a tour. "Though I still think you're being overprotective. The baby isn't due for another month. I could have helped with more of the work." "You've been helping plenty," Thomas countered, gesturing to her rounded figure. "Growing our child is work enough." The weather turned unexpectedly cold in early November. Penelope, now in her final weeks of pregnancy, found herself increasingly restless, unable to get comfortable whether sitting, standing, or lying down. Dr. Wilson visited regularly, assuring them that everything was progressing normally, but advised Penelope to remain close to home as her time approached. On the morning of November 12th, Thomas reluctantly prepared to ride out to the north pasture where the men were moving cattle to winter grazing lands. "I don't like leaving you," he said for the third time as Penelope helped him pack provisions for the day. "I'll be fine," she assured him. "Mrs. Thornton will be here this afternoon to help with the preserving, and you'll be back by sundown. This baby isn't coming today." Thomas looked unconvinced but finally mounted his horse. "Send Miguel if anything changes, anything at all." Penelope waved him off with a smile, then returned to the house to continue her preparations. She had just put a kettle on to boil when the first pains struck a tightening across her abdomen, unlike the practice contractions she'd been experiencing for weeks. She sat down, breathing carefully as Dr. Wilson had instructed her and waited. When nothing further happened for nearly an hour, she decided it had been a false alarm and resumed her work. By midday, however, the pains had returned with increasing frequency. When Mrs. Thornton arrived to find Penelope pausing in her canning to breathe through a contraction, the older woman immediately took charge. "This baby's not waiting for sundown, Mrs. Jenkins. Let's get you to bed while I send for the doctor and your husband." Events moved quickly after that. Penelope's labor progressed with textbook efficiency, as Dr. Wilson noted approvingly when he arrived. Thomas, however, was nowhere to be found. Miguel had ridden out immediately upon Mrs. Thornton's instruction, but returned alone, reporting that the men had split up to search for stray cattle and he couldn't locate the boss. As the afternoon waned and Penelope's labor intensified, she tried not to focus on Thomas's absence. "He'll never forgive himself if he misses this," she gasped between contractions. "Men have been missing their children's birth since the beginning of time," Mrs. Thornton replied practically. "Now focus on your breathing, dear." The sun had set by the time Penelope's son made his entrance into the world, announcing his arrival with lusty cries that echoed through the ranch house. Dr. Wilson cleaned and swaddled the infant, while Mrs. Thornton helped Penelope into a fresh nightgown. "He's perfect," the doctor pronounced, placing the tiny bundle in Penelope's arms. 8 pounds if he's an ounce, and a fine set of lungs." Penelope gazed down at her son, overwhelmed by the rush of love she felt for this small person who had been part of her for so long and was now his own being. He had Thomas's strong chin and what appeared to be the beginnings of her auburn hair. "Hello, Timothy," she whispered, using the name she and Thomas had agreed upon for a boy. "Your papa will be here soon to meet you." As if summoned by her words, the sound of hoofbeats pounded up to the house, followed by the thud of boots on the porch and the front door flying open. "Penelope," Thomas's voice was frantic as he burst into the bedroom, his clothes muddy and his face lined with worry. "We're here," she called softly, adjusting the blanket around their son. "We're both here." Thomas froze in the doorway, taking in the scene before him, his wife, tired but radiant, holding a small bundle in her arms. All color drained from his face, and for a moment Penelope feared he might faint. "Is that?" he whispered, unable to complete the question. "Come meet your son," Penelope invited, patting the edge of the bed beside her. Thomas approached cautiously, as if afraid that moving too quickly might shatter the moment. He sat gingerly on the bed, his eyes never leaving the tiny face nestled against Penelope's chest. "A son," he murmured, reaching out a tentative finger to touch the baby's cheek. "We have a son." "Timothy Charles Jenkins," Penelope confirmed. "He has your chin." Thomas looked from the baby to Penelope, his eyes suspiciously bright. "I'm so sorry I wasn't here. One of the young steers got stuck in mud down by the creek by the time we got him out and I got Miguel's message." He shook his head, unable to continue. "You're here now," Penelope assured him. "Would you like to hold him?" The expression of terror that crossed Thomas's face was almost comical. "He's so small, what if I drop him?" "You won't," Penelope said confidently, transferring the newborn to his father's arms. The sight of Thomas Jenkins, cattle rancher and frontier man, cradling his tiny son with infinite gentleness, was one Penelope knew she would carry in her heart forever. His large hands, calloused from years of rope and reins, supported the baby's head with exquisite care as he studied every feature of the little face. "Hello, Timothy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm your pa. I've been waiting to meet you for a long time." Winter came again, but this year it brought joy rather than hardship to the Jenkins household. Timothy thrived under his parents' devoted care, growing and changing daily in ways that fascinated them both. Thomas proved to be a natural father, as comfortable changing nappies as he was breaking horses, though he drew the line at singing lullabies, insisting that his voice would scare the poor boy into crying harder. Penelope recovered quickly from childbirth and established a routine that allowed her to manage both household and baby. In January, she began tutoring 3 children from neighboring ranches 2 mornings a week, a compromise that allowed her to keep her teaching skills sharp while remaining primarily at home with Timothy. The railroad construction progressed steadily, bringing new families to Chisum Ranch almost weekly. By spring, the town council had completed the schoolhouse and formally offered Penelope the position of teacher beginning the following September, when Timothy would be 10 months old. After careful consideration and long discussions with Thomas, she accepted. "Are you certain you're comfortable with this arrangement?" Penelope asked Thomas for what felt like the 100th time as they prepared for bed one night in late April. "Pen, we've talked this through every which way," he replied patiently. "Mrs. Thornton is happy to mind Timothy during school hours. The town house is a short walk from the school. You'll be home every afternoon and all day Saturday and Sunday. I think we can manage." She nestled against him, grateful for his support. "I just want to be sure we're doing what's best for all of us." "Having a happy mother who uses all her talents is what's best for Timothy," Thomas said firmly. "And for me too. I didn't marry you to turn you into someone else, Pen. I married you for who you are." The new life they were creating together, not just as parents, but as partners in the full sense, felt right to both of them, a balancing of traditional roles with their individual needs and abilities. When Thomas suggested hiring an additional hand so he could spend more time with Timothy on the days Penelope taught, she recognized it as the gift it was, his willingness to adapt his own role as much as she was adapting hers. Summer brought the completion of the railroad spur to Chisum Ranch, and with it, a flurry of activity as the town prepared for its new status as a transportation hub. The Mercantile expanded, a proper hotel replaced the old boarding house, and talk began of establishing a bank. For Thomas and Penelope, the railroad's arrival meant easier access to markets for their cattle and the ability to receive goods directly from the east. Thomas invested in additional breeding stock to expand their herd, while Penelope ordered books and teaching supplies for her classroom. In late August, just before Penelope was to begin teaching, they received unexpected visitors. The stagecoach delivered 2 women to their door one afternoon: Margaret Lawson, Penelope's aunt whom she hadn't seen since childhood, and her 20-year-old daughter, Patricia. "We read about the railroad opening in the newspaper," Margaret explained over tea in the parlor, her Boston accent sharp against the Texas drawls Penelope had grown accustomed to hearing. "When I saw the name Chisum Ranch, I remembered your letters mentioned it. We decided it was high time we saw where you'd ended up." The visitors regarded Timothy, now crawling determinedly across the floor, with a mixture of amusement and alarm. Patricia in particular seemed fascinated by the baby, though she kept a safe distance as if he might bite. "He's very energetic," she observed as Timothy pulled himself up on a chair and beamed at her with his 4-tooth smile. "He's a ranch baby," Penelope replied proudly. "He'll be running before we know it." Later, after Timothy had been put to bed and Thomas had excused himself to check on the evening chores, Aunt Margaret fixed Penelope with a penetrating stare. "Well, are you going to tell me the truth about your situation here?" Penelope blinked in surprise. "The truth? I'm not sure what you mean." "Penelope, dear, you disappeared from Boston to marry a stranger in the wilderness. Naturally, we all assumed the worst, that you were desperate or had been misled. I've come to see if you need rescuing." The idea was so absurd that Penelope couldn't help laughing. "Aunt Margaret, I assure you I'm exactly where I want to be. Thomas is a wonderful husband. We have a beautiful son, a prosperous ranch, and I'm about to begin teaching at the new school. What could I possibly need rescuing from? Margaret looked unconvinced. But the conditions out here. The isolation, the lack of culture and refinement, are balanced by community purpose and a freedom I never knew in Boston, Penelope finished firmly. I love my life here, Aunt Margaret, I truly do. The older woman studied her niece's face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I believe you do. How extraordinary. Aunt Margaret and Patricia stayed for a week, gradually adjusting to the rhythms of ranch life. Patricia, initially standoffish, became enchanted with Timothy and even ventured to the barn with Thomas to see the new foals. By the time they departed on the eastbound train, Penelope sensed a shift in their perception of her chosen life. You must visit us in Boston someday, Margaret said as they waited on the newly constructed platform. Bring that handsome husband and your son, show them where you came from. I'd like that, Penelope replied, surprised to realize she meant it. Boston no longer felt like home, but she could now think of it with fondness rather than the desperation that had driven her to leave. As summer turned to fall, Penelope began her teaching career in earnest. The schoolhouse filled with 23 pupils ranging from 6 to 16 years of age, a diverse group that included the children of ranchers, merchants, and railroad workers. The work was challenging but deeply satisfying, drawing on skills she had feared might be lost to her forever. Timothy, meanwhile, thrived under Mrs. Thornton's doting care during school hours and became a familiar sight around town, accompanying Penelope to and from the schoolhouse in his carriage. By his first birthday in November, he was walking independently and developing a vocabulary that consisted primarily of ma, pa, and cow, the last being applied indiscriminately to any animal he encountered. The celebration of Timothy's birthday coincided with the first anniversary of the railroad's arrival in Chisum Ranch, and the town council organized a community festival to mark both occasions. Thomas, who had gradually become more involved in town affairs, helped plan the event, while Penelope's students prepared recitations and songs to perform. On the day of the festival, the town square was decorated with bunting and lanterns. Tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by every household, and a platform had been constructed for the performances and speeches. Penelope, wearing a new dress of deep green that Thomas had surprised her with, moved through the crowd with Timothy on her hip, accepting birthday wishes for him and compliments on her students' preparations. Mrs. Jenkins, called Mrs. Sullivan, the mercantile owner's wife, the mayor is looking for your husband. It's almost time for the speeches. Penelope scanned the crowd for Thomas, finally spotting him in deep conversation with a man she didn't recognize, a stranger in a city suit that marked him as not from Chisum Ranch. Thomas, she called, making her way toward them. The mayor needs you. He looked up, his expression unreadable as he gestured for her to join them. Pen, this is Mr. Howard from the Texas Cattle Association. Mr. Howard, my wife, Penelope, and our son, Timothy. The man tipped his hat politely. Mrs. Jenkins, a pleasure. Your husband and I were just discussing a proposition that might interest you both. Before he could elaborate, the mayor's voice boomed from the platform, calling Thomas to join him. We'll continue this later, Thomas promised, squeezing Penelope's hand before making his way through the crowd. What proposition? Penelope asked the stranger once Thomas had gone. Mr. Howard smiled. The association is establishing regional offices throughout Texas. We need someone with knowledge of the industry and connections to local ranchers to serve as our representative in this area. Your husband's name came up repeatedly as a respected voice among cattlemen. Penelope considered this information as they moved closer to the platform to hear the speeches. Such a position would mean a significant change for Thomas, more administrative work, less time in the saddle. Would he want that? From the platform, the mayor was expounding on the growth of Chisum Ranch over the past year. And much of our success is due to citizens like Thomas Jenkins, who had the vision to see what our town could become and the determination to help make it happen. Thomas, come say a few words. Thomas stepped forward, looking uncomfortable with the attention but composed. "I'm not one for speeches," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the square, "but I am proud to be part of this community. A year ago, we celebrated the arrival of the railroad. Today, we're celebrating my son's first birthday." He paused as cheers and applause erupted. None of this would have been possible without the support of neighbors who became friends, and a wife who had the courage to travel across the country to a place she'd never seen, to marry a man she'd never met. His eyes found Penelope in the crowd, and the look they exchanged was worth more than any public declaration. Chisum Ranch is growing because we all work together, because we welcome newcomers and new ideas, because we understand that a community is only as strong as the bonds between its people. I'm honored to be part of it, and I look forward to watching it and my son continue to grow. The simplicity and sincerity of his words drew approving nods and warm applause. As Thomas rejoined Penelope and Timothy, she felt a surge of pride in the man he had become since she first collapsed at his door 2 years earlier, still the same hardworking, honorable rancher. But now also a community leader, a devoted father, and a partner who supported her dreams as fully as she supported his. "That was a fine speech," she told him, shifting Timothy to his arms. "Meant every word," he replied, "especially the part about my courageous wife." The festival continued into the evening, with lanterns illuminating the square as music and dancing commenced. Timothy, overwhelmed by the excitement and attention, fell asleep on his father's shoulder, his chubby hand still clutching the wooden horse that had been the mayor's birthday gift to him. "Should we take him home?" Thomas asked, swaying gently to keep the boy asleep. "In a little while," Penelope decided, enjoying the rare opportunity to see the entire community gathered in celebration. "Mr. Howard told me about the Cattle Association position they're considering you for." Thomas nodded. "It's an interesting opportunity. Would mean less time with the herd, more time in town, regular salary to supplement what the ranch brings in. Is it something you'd want?" He considered the question thoughtfully. "A year ago, I'd have said no without hesitation, but now I find myself thinking about the future differently. About what kind of life I want for Timothy, for any other children we might have." His free hand found hers, linking their fingers together. "What do you think?" "I think," Penelope said slowly, "that you would excel at it if it's what you want. And I think that we've become quite good at finding balance in our lives. If this is the next step in our journey together, we'll make it work." Thomas squeezed her hand. "I told Howard I'd give him my answer tomorrow. Tonight is for celebrating." As if on cue, the fiddler struck up a lively tune and couples began to form sets for a dance. Thomas glanced down at their sleeping son, then back at Penelope, his eyes twinkling with the boyish charm that still made her heart skip. "Save me a dance for later," he asked. "Always," she promised. The years that followed brought both challenges and joys to the Jenkins family. Thomas accepted the Cattle Association position, balancing those responsibilities with the management of their expanding ranch. Penelope continued teaching until the birth of their daughter, Eleanor, in 1878, then returned to the classroom on a reduced schedule that allowed her to balance her profession with motherhood. Timothy grew into a thoughtful boy with his father's practical nature and his mother's love of learning. Eleanor, from her earliest days, displayed a determination and independence that both delighted and exhausted her parents. The children flourished in the unique environment. Their parents had created a home that valued both books and horses, that respected tradition while embracing progress. Chisum Ranch itself evolved from a frontier outpost to a thriving town, its growth guided in no small part by citizens like Thomas and Penelope who served on committees, taught in its school, and invested in its future. The original Jenkins Ranch expanded as well, with Thomas applying modern breeding techniques and business practices to increase its productivity. In 1880, they made their first visit to Boston, a journey that allowed the children to meet their Eastern relatives and gave Penelope the opportunity to show her family the people and places of her youth. The visit was a success. though everyone agreed that Texas now felt more like home than Massachusetts ever could. On a golden afternoon in September 1884, exactly 10 years after Penelope had first collapsed at Thomas's door, they sat together on the porch of their ranch house, watching Timothy and Alina playing with their dog in the yard. The children's laughter carried on the warm breeze, mingling with the distant lowing of cattle and the singing of meadowlarks in the fields. "Do you ever think about how different our lives might have been?" Penelope asked, her hand finding Thomas's as it had countless times over the years. "If I'd never answered your advertisement, or if you'd never placed it." Thomas considered the question, his face weathered by years of Texas sun but still handsome, still capable of giving her that half-smile that made her feel like the only woman in the world. "I try not to dwell on might-have-beens, but I do think about how fortunate I was that day you arrived. Even half dead from travel fever, you were the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen," Penelope laughed. "I doubt that very much." "I remember being mortified that I'd made such a poor first impression." "Nothing poor about it," Thomas argued. "I knew right then when you collapsed in my arms that you were exactly where you belonged." "And was I?" she teased, though she already knew the answer. Thomas's arm circled her shoulders, pulling her close against his side. "10 years, 2 children, and all we've built together," says you were. "Every day I thank God you had the courage to make that journey." "And I thank God you were waiting at the end of it," Penelope replied softly. As the sun began to set, painting the Texas sky in brilliant hues of orange and gold, their children's voices called them to join the game they were playing. Hand in hand, Thomas and Penelope descended the porch steps, moving toward their future together as they had for the past decade, with love, with purpose, and with the certainty that home wasn't a place, but the people with whom you shared your heart.